Hey Craig,
Hey, Simon.
what do you have for me today?
Well, today we're going to be looking at a few super fascinating stories. The kind of research hole I fell down is looking at outsider artists, particularly kind of people whose work was discovered only posthumously and have kind of since enjoyed that subsequent appreciation. But before I get too far into that, what do you know about outsider art? Or if you know anything about it, what comes to mind? Like, what would your off-the-cuff definition be?
Yeah, giving you a little behind the scenes look at the makings of this podcast. We actually recorded part of this episode last week, just the intro, and we had to scrap it because of technical details. So I do know what outsider art is at the very least. It's seems to be art that um like you said, it's often discovered posthumously, although I don't know if that's required every single time. But it's someone who is not part of the art community who may not even consider themselves artists, but their work is discovered and adopted and regarded as art by the art community. Is that kind of the gist of it?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, because it's sort of like, and actually what you're getting into is like the discovery by the art community, because that's really, it seems to be what like the honorific of artist is then applied, right? Once the people who are appreciators and experts sort of, once they're like, okay, I give this my artist seal of approval, and this is now art.
Yeah. Yeah.
Exactly, right. And so there's actually kind of four stories that I have to share about outsider artists, and they're all super interesting. And they all have some commonalities that I kind of came up with as I was just kind of like doing all of this furious Googling about examples of outsider artists. And we'll get into that though, and then I think it also kind of leads into a discussion about sort of like, is this thing even possible anymore? In the kind of world in which we kind of live and feel compelled to share anything. But before we get into that, Simon, what is the name of this podcast?
The name of this podcast is Momentary Experts, and you can find it wherever you get your podcast or on YouTube. And I think this episode, as much as I try to get Craig not to have episodes with a lot of visuals, he still stubbornly does. And I believe that this episode will have a lot of visuals, so it's probably best viewed on the YouTube channel for Momentary Experts. Okay, Craig, take it away. You're on mute.
Yeah, you also make it sound like I've done this like a bunch of times. This is really only the second time. You're like, every time, Craig, I tell you,
Well, we've
you.
only produced like 7 episodes, so that's like 30 or 40% of our episodes.
Okay, well, you don't have that many observation points. It wouldn't it wouldn't pass peer review. But I'll go ahead and share the screen, and this is the last time I'll do it. But yeah, for those of you watching a video, you will get to see some pretty images today. So thank you for tuning in on YouTube. And for those of you
Okay.
listening at home, Simon will try to describe them as best as he can.
Yeah.
So
Okay. I think I just shared the ability for you to share the screen. There we go.
a slideshow.
Click to add title. Wow, that is good art.
Oh, fuck off, Simon. Okay. So uh before we get into the four stories of outsider artists, um please describe for me and for the listeners at home who aren't watching this what you're seeing.
So we're looking at I thought the first time you showed me this, I thought it was an aerial version of a urinal, but it's actually a urinal on its side, sitting on some kind of looks like a wooden block or pedestal, and the words R Mutt 1917 have been ascribed on what would normally be the top of the urinal, but because of the angle that the urinal is sitting, it's on the front of the urinal.
Exactly, yeah. So you're kind of imagine if you're not seeing this on a video that yeah, you're kind of like you're against a wall looking down, and so like the little pointy bit of the urinal decided to catch all the drips is like pointing up, right? So it's
Yeah.
it's been basically put on its side or on its back,
Yeah,
which is the only flat
it's like a
part.
pyramid or like the top of like a baby's bottle or something like that.
Exactly, exactly, yeah. And so this piece was is a famous kind of modern art piece by Marcel Duchamp. It was part of an exhibition of the Society of Independent Artists in 1917. That's why it has 1917 on it. And basically, Duchamp went and he purchased a urinal at a plumbing supply store, wrote R. Mutt 1917 on it, flipped it on its side and put it in the exhibition and said, "This is an art because I'm an artist and I'm presenting it at an art exhibition." So, the I think the big conversation about this piece, and we had that a little bit last time before technical difficulties derailed us, but why is this art, or is it art? I don't know. What are your thoughts?
Does R Mutt have any significance, or is that just random
I
letters?
was I was reading about it. It's some sort of kind of pun, I guess, because there was so it was the Mott Plumbing Company, but Mutt, I guess there was like a famous daily cartoon strip, and so it's something to do with that. But I really don't think a whole lot of thought went into. I don't think he was like workshopping dozens of names to put on the urinal, right? It was just kind of like Armot, 1917.
So I don't think it's art because there's nothing creative. I think like the root of art is some doing something creative, and so I just don't see how this is creative at all or thought provoking. It's not you would have to do a stretch to make this symbolize something. It's just a urinal on its side.
It is a urinal on its side, right? And to be fair to Duchamp, I don't think he ever said it was good art. Um,
But is it,
but
I'm not even I'm just saying it's not even art because
yeah,
there's no creativity to it.
yeah. Well, so I think kind of what you're getting into is kind of the kind of dual definition of the word art a little bit, right? So there's art in terms of what is the strictest definition of the word art, and then there's art in terms of sort of like a label that we put on something when it has transcended some baseline for creation, and you're like, that's art. And for you, yeah, which is fair, this is not passing that bar, which can be very low, and then this still wouldn't pass it. On the other hand, it could be argued that what Duchamp, and we don't have him here to interview because he's been dead for a very long time, he what he might have been sort of trying to do here is provoke a conversation that we're admittedly still having right now about this piece, as to this whole idea of what is this, like, what's the new definition of art, like we like in with where art is going and where it's moved, right? And is something art simply because an artist says it is art and presents it as art and includes it in an exhibition, right?
Mhm.
um like, is that art, right? And it's not making a itself sort of, obviously it can't, its own sort of like value judgment here, and it's not coming to a conclusion, right? But it is provoking that conversation, and I think if that is the way that you read the piece, then it's been incredibly successful, obviously, because people are still talking about this thing, right? It's provoked so much conversation about sort of culture and art and what we call art and what we don't call art. Um, and again, whether or not it's good is up to the eye of the beholder. I'm myself not a big fan of the piece. But yeah, there you go. It's important if nothing else. So,
But
but
he's
with
not
that,
considered an outsider artist.
oh God, no, no,
Yeah.
no. And actually, he interestingly, at some point, I think mid-career, he famously kind of just declared that he had finished art, and then he quit art, and then he became a competitive chess player.
Hmm. A
Yeah.
more noble profession, I would say,
He
considering
was
what I've seen of his so far.
well, I mean, he could do like sort of more craft heavy visual art, right? But this is sort of, I guess, him getting into like experimentation, and also, yeah, just kind of talking about the art world as it was evolving at the time. But with these kind of ideas in mind as to, is this art? Why not? What definition of art are you using? Let's get into these four super interesting stories about outsider artists. So the first one, The Streets of Chicago. Now, I had asked you if you knew her name last time. Do you remember the name off the top of your head?
Was it a Vivian?
Vivian Meyer, exactly, yes. So
Okay.
she's probably the most celebrated recent example of outsider artist who has come to. Um, I've always said posthumous. How do you pronounce it?
Posthumous, yeah.
Or because okay, I thought you had pronounced it differently. I often don't pronounce things correctly. If I was doing it wrong, I wanted to know. Anyway, so the story of Vivian Meyer. Um, sorry. Um, Vivian Meyer, in 2007. a storage unit came up for auction. So you've seen those kind of reality TV shows like Storage Wars where everyone gets together and then like there's like a storage unit and the rent has lapsed and now they're auctioning the contents. Then people auction it and then they go through and then they tell you how much it's worth and it's always like obviously staged. That's why it's
Yeah,
like a box full of moldy Reader's Digest, a futon, like and a Rothko, right? It's
yeah,
just
yeah,
sort of like this thing completely out of place that shouldn't be
yeah.
there, but it's staged. Well, this is one of
It's based on a real thing that actually happens,
Mhm.
but it's been incorporated into reality TV to
Yeah,
where they could add a level of predictability to it
yeah,
by staging it.
yeah. And actually, so I guess like in the first season of that show, from what I was reading about it, they actually tried. So one, they did real storage units, and then two, they actually went and found the people whose sort of rents on them had elapsed. So I guess one of the things that happens when you store something in a storage unit is you agree that if you fall behind on your
Yeah.
rent, they can seize it and auction it.
Yeah.
And then they asked these
And
people,
just so like for the five people who have, not that we actually have five listeners, but for the five people who don't know what this concept is, it's that, if someone rents out a storage locker, they sign some agreement to where after if they go a certain number of months in arrears of not paying their rent,
Mhm.
then the storage unit gets to seize their asset, everything that's in the storage unit, and own it. And rather than the storage unit, the owner of the storage units going through each individual lot and rummaging through it and trying to find something valuable that they can then auction off, for some reason, which I don't completely understand, they've turned it almost into a game show where in you have like a list, you have a group of people who are basically bidding on a particular storage unit, and they will open the storage unit and the people aren't allowed to step inside, and
Yeah,
based entirely on what they can see from like 10 feet away, they all start bidding on how much they're willing to pay for all of the contents of the storage unit.
right.
And I don't know if this is because they can actually make more money this way because there's a degree of chance, to it, that they actually end up making more money, the storage unit owners, whether they make more money this way because people will bid outrageous sums based on something that they don't completely understand the value of, or I don't understand why this ecosystem grew out the way that it did, but it's just this weird quirk. And so I think This American Life did an episode about it back before the reality TV show, and maybe that's what caused the popularity of it. And then
Yeah,
uh yeah. So anyway, sorry, that was a long explanation of what the scenario was. But in
right.
2007, you're saying one of these storage units basically was in arrears, and so they did one of these auctions for that storage unit.
Yeah, and so one of these storage units, which had gone up for sale, was full of um, uh, boxes and boxes of undeveloped film negatives, um, thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And actually, I think a few different collectors bought them. One in particular, a guy named John Maloof, I believe, is also a filmmaker who made this movie called Searching for Vivian Maier. Bought about, I don't know, 30,000 of them, and then kind of brought her work to light thanks to Flickr, largely. But Vivian Maier was a woman who lived and worked as a nanny in Chicago for about 40 years and did street photography using a Rolleiflex camera. So you can see a Rolleiflex here. Do you want to describe the oddity of a Rolleiflex, Simon?
And would she have even called it street photography, or would she have just like said, "I'm just taking photographs"?
I don't think street photography was even a word.
Yeah. Okay. So this looks like an old-timey camera that, from what I can tell, you hold at abdomen level, and then it looks like you can look down into a little viewfinder. So I'm guessing you can get a sense of what the camera is going to take a photo of.
Yeah, yeah. It's got a weird viewfinder system where you've got to look down into the camera. Yeah, and then yeah, so that thing pops up and then you can see reflected like a almost like a periscope reflects the image that you're taking a picture of. And so
This seems like a terrible camera because then you would be forced to only take photos from the same exact perspective every time.
yeah, it did limit the perspective, but Vivian Maier put it to great use because I think because she was able to hold it rather comparatively unobtrusively at her abdomen instead of, like if someone walks up to you and holds like a real camera up to their face,
Yeah.
you're gonna notice that, right? But she was able to be more surreptitious in it. And what came to light was, and I'm just gonna scroll through some pictures here. And here you can see her taking a picture of her own reflection. That's the Vivian Meyer holding her trusty Rolleiflex. Um, it is it really an unparalleled body of street photography.
Mhm.
The vast majority is in Chicago, but a lot is in New York. And I mean, I just picked kind of these slides at random. So here's a fantastic photo of a young man riding a horse bareback under the L in Chicago, right? And one of the things that immediately stands out about Vivian Meyer's photos is just the outstanding, well, everything, the focus, the exposure, right? So if you're shooting in film, exposure can be hard to get because you can't see it until you develop it really, and then you're kind of seeing what you're working with here. Yeah, so here's this great image of and the vast majority are black and white, of a young man riding a horse bareback under the L tracks in Chicago. Here's a
And when
young
were these
man.
taken? These were taken over like the 40 years of her career.
Yeah, all the ones I'm showing you here are probably like 40s and 50s and 60s. Yeah.
Oh, 40s, 50s, and 60s. Oh, okay, so so this was taken a lot. These were taken way before the storage unit went
Yeah.
up for auction. Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
And do we know, was it her storage unit or do we know anything about who owned the storage unit?
It was hers, and
Okay.
then she experienced a lot of financial difficulties apparently later in her life, and it had lapsed, and then she had lost it. Yeah,
Yeah.
and so here's this great image of a young man in Chicago holding some pigeons, and again, just sort of like the delicateness of the exposure, the muscles on his cheek, the focus is really outstanding because she didn't have autofocus, right?
Yeah.
Like a camera now will autofocus. She had to do that on the fly, looking down through a viewfinder, but not be so obvious that people would look up and sort of know what she was doing.
So I have a question. So
Yeah.
it's generally assumed that she was not did not consider herself like an artist or anything like that, as evidenced by the fact that these were just negatives. But like, isn't it possible that she did consider herself an artist and that she did get these photos developed and they're just lost to history? Like she was like an obscure artist that never really was able to do anything with it, and then those photos got lost to history, and then it just so happened that these negatives got found.
Well, to the first question, yeah, it's entirely possible that she considered herself an artist. I mean, we don't
Mhm.
know because she
Mhm.
was, by the time the auction, so she actually passed away in 2009. It took that Maloof guy 2 years to track her down, and then she had already passed away. So we
Mhm.
don't know what she considered herself. She was an intensely private person. We do know that
Mhm.
because in the documentary, they interview the people who she nannied for and people who knew her, and they were like, yeah, she was a really odd lady. She was intensely private, kept to herself. But then as far as the developing goes, so the storage units were not just the negatives. There were some prints in there, not a lot.
Mhm. Mhm.
But the rolls were undeveloped,
Mhm.
right? So
Okay,
these
so that
weren't developed negatives, they were still in the
okay.
rolls.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So she never even got the vast majority developed. It wasn't like she got them developed and then kept the negatives and we've lost the prints. She didn't even
Mhm.
develop them.
Mhm. Okay.
Uh, and by the way, the current body of her work stands at about 150,000 images.
Wow.
Just yeah, enormous. She worked a lot with shadow in this really inventive way. There's this photo here. It looks like she's taken it from I the perspective's really hard to understand here, but it looks like this may be a reflection in a window of some people and their shadows on the street. It's just like it's super cool and abstract and kind of gets into art photography. Here's another. She took a lot of self-reflections. There's her shooting her Rolleiflex, and then she has metered so that the people in her reflection are going to be in um sort of like the light's going to be metered for them, which is just and it's just awesome.
Wait, so
Um
that photo's through a window. So
yeah.
so you're seeing the reflection of her in the
Hmm.
window, but you're seeing a much clearer version of what's inside the actual
Yeah,
thing.
because she's using her own reflection in the window to block some of the light, so she's metered for them.
Okay,
That's why the
but
reflection
everything in
around.
there is vague because it's only by her blocking the light that she's able to make part of what's inside visible.
Yeah, exactly. That's why you look around her and it's much more washed out. It's much more
Hmm.
gray. Um, and then just lots of street level. Obviously, that's a woman. They're about the same height, but she's shooting up from her abdomen, right? So these really great sort of glimpses of just ordinary people and their fashion. Here's a woman with a fur coat and kind of a veil over her eyes, elderly. Sometimes people are looking at the camera.
Hmm.
Sometimes they're not. I love that guy there. He looks straight out of like a Norman Rockwell painting.
Yeah. Have you ever,
Um,
just slightly related, have you ever seen the documentary Bill Cunningham, New York?
no.
Oh, you would love it. It's incredible. Put it on your list. It's about this street photographer. He's dead now, but he worked for the New York Times for years. He was like their fashion on the street photographer. But he was like an incredibly quirky, weird dude who, even though he was like obsessed with fashion and getting these great shots, he himself was like the most unfashionable person you could ever imagine. But anyway,
Interesting. Okay. Uh,
highly recommend that documentary.
Bill Cunningham, you said?
Yeah, it's called Bill
Okay.
Cunningham, New York.
Okay. She took a lot of pictures of like down and out people, people who are not often photographed in the era.
Mhm.
Um, so here we have obviously a homeless man. He's filthy. He's eating a sandwich. He looks like he might be drunk. Just
Mhm.
kind of he's sitting on a board. Um, so it's largely I mean, part of it's true because it was pre-fast fashion, but there's this conception that everybody always dressed nicer in the 50s. Like,
Mhm.
well, also what you're seeing is self-selection because it cost money to have photos done, so people would usually dress up for family photos,
Yeah.
you know. But here we see this guy who wouldn't stand out if he was like a homeless guy in Chicago today.
Mhm.
Here's this great, I love this. It's a newspaper vendor sleeping in his booth, right? And then you can see all the covers of the magazines from the 40s or 50s or whenever this is, including a New Yorker issue there. If you look to the right at the top.
Right at the top. Yeah, I see it. It's funny that Life is in there. I was actually thinking of making one of these momentary experts episodes about Life magazine and the some weird stuff around that. But keep on going.
Yeah. And you know a lot about the New Yorker too, and I know almost nothing, so that could be a cool topic
Yeah.
too. And then finally, here's her again, kind of half in shadow, half not. I really like this photo too because it's also, if you've ever shot with film, and again, sort of understanding like metering, it's really difficult to shoot a subject that's half shadow and half not. Because if you meter too much for the shadow, then the rest of it's going to be blown out. Like it's going to be so bright that you won't be able to see it. But she knows enough about her camera somehow to intuitively, she meters for the part of herself that's in light, and then you get this sort of gradient, and then like her right arm is like completely black here, but it's super well done. And again, like a lot of her shadow work just is like very much art photography.
Well, I
So
just it makes you wonder, was this self-taught or was she, on her days off, was she going to photography classes or anything like that?
not that they've ever been able to find. They've actually pieced together her life very well.
Oh.
Um, because also these storage units had, she was obsessive about receipts. She kept uh correspondence, documentation. She's very much a pack rat, right? So
Wow.
there's this great image of this Maloof guy's sort of living room, and he's just got these stacks of stuff, prescriptions, receipts, letters. Um, she saved pretty much everything, right? And as far as we know, she didn't take photography class. She was self-taught.
Yeah. I wonder what the intellectual property implications of this are. Because even though he owns the negatives, the way that copyright works, it's the actual creator of
Hmm.
the work that owns the copyright. So do these images, does the IP of them fall into whatever errors she might have or anything like that?
Okay, well, I'm gonna try to, as a de facto copyright librarian, I'll try to explain this as quickly as possible. I don't know the specifics of this case. There probably has been some back and forth about that, but basically, prior to the Copyright Act of 1976, you did have to register copyright.
Mhm.
Now you don't have to register copyright. So any creative expression that is fixed in a tangible medium, including digital, is automatically the copyright is owned by the creator for the life of the creator plus 75 years.
Yeah.
But most of these were created prior to 1975, and
Oh,
then
okay.
so I'm guessing if she didn't register, or 1996, if she didn't register the copyright, then they would actually not be protected and then fall under the public domain. But copyright sort of like is kind of like um, for example, you've heard of fair use and the four factors of fair use, which is sort of like I guess like a sibling to public domain
Mhm.
considerations. Although I mean the public domain means that no copyright applies, but I know it can get sticky if a work has never been published, right? So works that are unpublished have a different kind of protection.
Mhm.
Um, I'm guessing a lot of them actually were just sort of public domain. So like a famous example of like a well-known intellectual property that isn't public domain because they didn't register it is the Night of the Living Dead.
Yeah, I know the story for that.
Yeah, yeah. But I don't know the specifics about this. I mean, obviously, whatever was the issue has been sorted out because there's been multiple books and a documentary.
Mhm.
I'm guessing that maybe, yeah, because they were never registered, that sort of like the copyright protection lapsed and then he owns them now. But then, yeah, I should have actually done more research in that,
So
anticipating your
he
question.
could, but since he owns the physical copies of the negatives, presumably he could sell the negatives for a lot of money.
Yeah, yeah. Although at this point he's now bought something like 90% of her entire output. Originally, it was like different collectors bought lots of her stuff, and he's been collecting it ever since then. It's like a foundation.
How's he been collecting what was outside of the storage unit? It wasn't that the sum total of her work?
I think there have been some other stuff that has been found of her, like belongings. He purchased that. He also then, I think, managed to get the money together to buy the stuff from the other collectors.
Was he an artist or photographer himself? Like how did he recognize?
He was a filmmaker,
Okay.
and then he put her work up on Flickr, and that was kind of this snowball effect, right? Of
Yeah.
and like I mean, shit, I could have had 200 images on here. I just picked these literally at random after like a Google image search, right?
Yeah.
There's so much. It's mind-boggling, which really begs. So like she's a fascinating figure because, well, one, um, who was she? As you've asked, like all these questions. Two, why didn't she ever display her work? But even more than that, why didn't she even attempt to develop most of it? It was this sort of singular obsession with doing street photography, but then once the images had been taken, whatever sort of itch was satisfied, and she didn't even try to develop the vast majority of it, just kind of tossed the roll into a box and kept it.
Yeah.
But yeah, she's kind of the most famous example. But now I'm going to get into, for
Well,
example,
one other thing before you go on, it strikes me also like with found art and outsider artists, like so much depends on the person who actually finds the art. Like if that had been some weird yokel or something like that who had no appreciation for it, it probably they may have gotten some of the stuff developed. They probably would have just thrown it away. But either way, it would not. She would not be famous now. I'm reminded of the story. Supposedly, this might be apocryphal. I haven't looked it up, but like Moby Dick had fallen into complete obscurity
Mhm.
after Herman Melville's death, and it was only some person who was randomly in a library and found the book kind of squirreled away in the whaling section of the library. And that was how supposedly Moby Dick was rediscovered. And then, now it's in literary canon and everything like that. And, these weird coincidences that drive this like massive resurgence and appreciation for something is kind of interesting.
Right. And yeah, that's actually going to become a recurrent theme here is that these people, their work happened to be found by the right person, which also, really does make you wonder like how many other cases of these kinds of people have there been?
Hmm.
And we don't know about it because the right person didn't happen to find them. So a
Yeah.
great example is the Sonora Aero Club. Have you ever heard of this guy?
Just because we shot part of this, but I've already kind of forgotten most of it, was
Okay.
that he
Oh,
was
right, right.
he was this guy who was creating these illustrations for this
Mhm.
completely made up society or something like that.
Yeah. So in the 1960s, an antique dealer in Houston, Texas, is walking down the street and he spots a dozen notebooks that are piled up on the sidewalk to be thrown away. He looks through them. There's something in it he likes, and I think probably being an antiques dealer, he had the presence of mind to buy them. instead of
Mhm.
just pick them up and take them because that firmly establishes ownership.
Yeah.
But he bought them for $100 in 1962 money, which I don't know how much 1962 $100 is. It's probably like a grand now, right?
Yeah.
Enough money. Like he waves a crisp $100 bill at them. They're not going to say no. Sure, weirdo, buy or crash. Okay, yes, I guess I'll give you a receipt, right?
And it's trash that maybe had been like you said what was the store? It was like an antique store.
It was an antiques dealer, but he
Yeah.
spotted them in front of a home. It was actually his family that had thrown them out.
He was an antique dealer. He
Yes,
he spotted the notebooks in front of a house.
yes,
Okay, so for all we know, the notebooks have been created by someone living in a house.
yes. We know
Okay.
who made them, and yeah,
Okay.
his family had just thrown them away when they were cleaning out his like attic bedroom.
And was he alive or dead at the time?
He was dead.
Okay. Okay.
Um, so they languished for about a year or two until an art student in the antique store spotted them and persuaded the dealer to loan her some for an exhibition, I think, on the history of flight. And this brought them to the attention of the outside art world. A few were bought by an art collector for like $1,500. And now, well, so most recently in 2016, a single double-sided page from these books fetched $22,500 at Christie's, and they're 12 full notebooks.
Mhm.
And yeah, they detail the history of something called the Sonora Aero Club, and they're a mixture of carnival banner illustration aesthetic, collage, taking images of airplanes and cutouts of newspapers from or of magazines and pasting them together with some illustrations and lots of weird symbols. Um, and lots of these sort of super interesting, sort of mechanical, almost looks like patent like
Yeah.
illustrations
Yeah.
of fantastical flying machines, right? So, um, this is Professor Larless on Otto Kraus is the title. Professor Larless is one of the people who's a member of the Scenario Club, and it's labeled as to sort of the things that this flying machine does. What you see here, there's sort of like a front view of kind of a plane. It's late with labels including gliding keel and then presumably like propellers, just like super cool looking, all very brightly colored. Here's one for like a mechanical, what looks almost like a hot air balloon, but with like ropes and pulleys and even a gun sticking out of the top, interestingly. This is, again, Otto Kraus is a name that pops up a lot. And some people did some research and tried to figure this out. There is no Sonora Aero Club. It never existed. It was the invention of this guy's sort of fancy was this fantastical aeronautical club that worked with flying machines in California. And so he created these 12 books as the scrapbook collection as if he were a member of the Sonora Aero Club and detailing all of their inventions and their comings and going. Here's another. This is like a lot of them have this sort of like interesting aesthetic of like being mirrored. Here's like a double propellered flying machine. Again, there's like a name on it of the person who supposedly invented it. Um, it has a strong aesthetic of like carnival banner painting, so like but like early 1900s, late 1800s carnival banners, you like you've seen that like color palette of like the Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus, right? Like
Mhm.
that kind of aesthetic. Um, Detailed descriptions of the flying machines and etc. And so
Yeah.
it turns out
And
that, sorry, go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, like, so I'm assuming after this became famous and started selling, they went back and interviewed his family members and was like, "Who the hell is this guy?"
Yeah. Um, so the guy who created it, his name was Charles Deleschau. He was a German man, born in Prussia in 1830. He worked as a butcher. He moved to Texas in 1860. He apparently served in the Confederate Army during the Civil War because there is a record in 1865 of him signing a general amnesty oath that was offered to former Confederate soldiers, which was like amnesty from prosecution for treason. And then he went back to working, and then he retired in 1899. and lived in an attic apartment in Houston, Texas. And this is the first year of his diaries. The first diary of the Sonora Aero Club is dated 1899,
Hmm.
when he was already 69 years old. And then
And
the last,
these were discovered in the 1960s, you said?
yeah.
Oh, wow.
And then the last diary is 1922, a year before he died at age 93. So he created these 12 books over the course of 23 years. And then they apparently then sat in the attic for nearly 40 years, and then eventually someone threw them out. And that's when this Houston antiques dealer happened to be walking by at the right time, found them, bought them.
And
As
so
far as
it wasn't his family's house. He was just renting he was just renting an attic apartment or something.
Oh no, like it was like he was living with his family. He was
Oh,
living like
okay.
with relatives. And then
Okay.
but apparently I mean at this point, it's like great grandpappy Charles's stuff, and it's just
Yeah.
these kind of notebooks, and they just tossed them out. They had no idea that he had ever made them. And then he never attempted to display any of his work, as far as anyone knows, or even showed it to anyone. And yeah, it's one of those examples like you were talking about. If this guy hadn't been walking by at the exact right time and bought them, we wouldn't know about them. They would have ended up in a landfill and they'd be lost. As it is, I looked at the Wikipedia page for his work, and it currently lists 55 different art exhibitions that people have bothered to include in the Wikipedia page, that have showed his work, right?
Hmm. Yeah.
And yeah, like I said, in 8 years ago at Christie's, a single double-sided page of this sold for $22,500. So from this collection of notebooks that he'd never showed anyone to being sort of like highly prized, sort of like uh, auction items. Which kind of brings me to kind of my first, I think, observed qualification for outsider artist. And it seems to be a commonality, which is you see this, and it pops up again and again, this monomaniacal obsession with a single thing,
Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
So most artists, if they're working in the art world, they won't just do one thing. Like they'll move around, they'll experiment with new techniques, they'll have different subjects, right? But
They don't want to get stuck in a creative rut where they're
yeah,
just like not iterating at all.
exactly. But with Vivian Meyer, it was apparently just this obsessive compulsion to take the photos.
Hmm.
And then with this guy, it was, um, just documenting the annual events of this fictitious Aero Club, right? In 12 different notebooks. These are pretty thick notebooks too, a couple hundred pages a piece. Um, and just all about kind of one thing. So it's these, and we'll see it time and time again. It's these individuals who just they get obsessed with doing one thing, and then they do it, and they do it, and they do it for a long time and create a big body of work, without really showing it to anyone. So that the common feature of outsider artists is this, probably because they're separated from the art world, right? And they're not sort of possibly even thinking of themselves as like making art, right? They're obeying this impulse they have, this obsessive impulse to do this thing. Then you just get sort of this weird singular laser focus that not many people ever have. A better example of that kind of like sort of huge
Well,
production.
I just wonder what like this guy's influence was because like was he reading some kind of fiction about aeronautical fantasy science
Must have
fiction or something
been.
like
I
that?
mean, considering the first one was 1899, and like that was even 4 years before the Wright brothers, but I mean, people were experimenting with like, I think Langley tried his flying machine and died doing it in like the 1893 or something like that, or maybe 1899, right? So like
Yeah.
there were news articles about people trying to fly, and there were hot air balloonists, right? And there were people sort of thinking about flying machines, and you would get sort of, I mean, like around the world in 80 days, and like there was like fantastical fiction about people in flying machines and stuff. So yeah, he was
Yeah.
exposed to it. And then for whatever reason, he became obsessed with it.
Yeah. Okay.
Um, so a even better example of this sort of like huge production, like obsessive production, is the story of the Vivian Girls. So have you ever heard of Henry Darger?
No.
Okay. Henry Darger was a hospital custodian in Chicago, Illinois. He lived from 1892 to 1973, and he has a sad life. When he was a young child, he was placed into I'm reading here, the Illinois Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children. He escapes in 1808 by jumping a train. He's quickly apprehended and brought back. He escapes again in 1909. His dad is dead by this point, and he relocates to Chicago. He finds a relative who gets him employment at a Catholic hospital where he works as a custodian. And save for a stint in the army after being drafted in World War One, he settles into a routine that lasts the rest of his life. He lives a largely solitary life. He never marries. He doesn't have many friends. He goes to mass 5 times a day.
What?
And yeah,
Oh my God.
yeah. And he works as a custodian at this hospital. And after his death, we learned that he wrote and wrote and wrote and wrote. Because after he died, a work was discovered in his small rented room. It was an illustrated book entitled, I'm going to have to get off camera here and read this because it's very long. The story of the Vivian girls in what is known as the realms of the unreal of the Glandeco-Angelinian war storm caused by the child slave rebellion. Would you like to guess how long the book is? It's unfinished, by the way.
11,000 pages.
15,145.
It's a
And
it's a it's a narrative story that's also illustrated.
mhm,
Okay.
yeah. And here's kind of the style of illustration. So, um, I have obviously haven't read this. I'm never gonna. I'm just gonna read the Wikipedia summary of the story. And it's insane. The book, quote, follows the adventures of the daughters of Robert Vivian, 7 princesses of the Christian nation of Abyenia, who assisted a daring rebellion against the child slavery imposed by John Manly and the Glandolinians. The children take up arms in their own defense and are often slain in battle or viciously tortured by the Glandolinian overlords. The elaborate mythology includes a setting of a large planet around which Earth orbits as a moon, where most people are Christian, where most people are Christian and mostly Catholic, and a species called the Blingigelmininians, or Blingans for short, gigantic winged beings with curved horns who occasionally take human or part human form, even disguising themselves as children. They are usually benevolent, but some Blingans are extremely suspicious of all humans due to Glandolinian atrocities.
So is this so there, one of two things is true. One, this is actually good literature and that's why it's famous. Or two, it's not good literature, but it's just like the reason that it's famous is because a combination of the guy being completely a recluse and also the level of obsessiveness that would go into writing something that's 15,000 pages.
It's the second.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so here are just kind of a series of the illustrations of it. Now, the book is lavishly illustrated with a lot of collage, a lot of watercolor, um, some
Are there like
fold.
volumes of this book that you can buy today?
I don't know. I mean, I think there's like coffee table books of like the artwork. But yeah, so you can see kind of in the middle of this one where it's 2 pages pasted together. A lot of the time, the book pages they'll fold out to have these big, long, very wide scenes. So here's a battle of the Child Slave Rebellion. Sometimes they're 30 feet long,
What are 30
uh,
foot long?
the pages.
Wow.
So you can see here, yeah, like there's a split in the middle. So this is one page that would fold out from the book. And
Yeah.
then in order to turn the page, you would fold it back in. But sometimes you would keep going. So the page as it folded out would be like an accordion and it would be 30 feet long.
So this guy was going and working his janitor job, and then when he wasn't doing that, he was going to mass 5 times a day.
Times a day.
And when he was not doing that, he was sitting alone somewhere, either in his own apartment or a coffee shop or something, and he was just working on this like obsessive tome that, for all we know, was never meant to see the light of day.
Yeah. So here you can kind of see an example of how it's a combination of like collage and drawing, because I'm pretty sure that little like character in the background peeking over the fence. Here we see, for those people at home, it's two of the horned girls. I think those were the Blengans who have taken human form, and like they're nude, and then there's like a cartoon cat in the background. So it's like this combination of like watercolor and pencil drawings and collage.
Yeah.
Um, Also, you can't really tell here. I think there's a later one you can tell better. Yeah, he apparently did not know that women have vaginas
Oh, okay.
because everyone has a penis,
Yeah.
right? Which is interesting.
Hmm.
Um, so he was apparently inspired by, and I didn't include a photo here, I should have. He was inspired by, we know from like his diary, the 1911 kidnapping and murder of a girl named Elsie Parobek. She was 4 years old. Um, and he saw her photo in a newspaper. She'd been kidnapped and murdered, and he spent the next 60 years creating a fantasy world inspired by it, in which these sort of like child slave children rebel against kind of their evil overlords and try to fight back. So yeah, in the background here, you've got some sort of a battle scene going on. There's some like fantastical beings that look like, I don't know, like dragon peacocks, I guess. There's like men with guns running around. It's bonkers, right?
Hmm.
He also wrote several books in like long form. I know one was supposed to be sort of a story of his life, and then quickly veers off for 4,000 pages to talk about a sentient tornado named Little Sweetie.
Okay.
Um, but yeah, just because of sort of the voluminous sort of and just sort of like the fascinating sort of like folk art nature of it, I guess, these have become very, very valuable in the art world.
Yeah.
So there's a sort of a court case. I don't know if it's been settled yet, but like his distant relatives are trying to like seize control of his stuff. It was awarded to the people who were his landlords. And the reason why is, in 2014, a larger double-sided page. Remember, I said that some of these pages are like 30 feet long.
Hmm.
A larger double-sided page at a auction sold for $745,000.
Yeah.
The lowest price that one of his works has achieved, and only 33 have gone up for auction, is a mere $10,350. Remember, this is a 15,000 page book,
Yeah.
right? There's a lot of money there. Um, but yeah, like Delachaux, he never attempted to exhibit or publish his work. Nobody who knew him knew he was doing it. He would go to mass 5 times a day. He would be a custodian at the hospital. He would go home and just obsessively write this 15,000 page book of just insanity, right? So
Yeah.
again, you have that kind of monomaniacal sense of being obsessed with one thing.
Yeah. And at
Um,
least two out of the three of the people we talked about, at least I don't, maybe all three, have been kind of loner, quasi recluse type people who were didn't seem to have like a lot of friends.
yeah, Charles Delachaux wasn't apparently that much of a recluse. He did have family, he did marry, he did have kids, but
Hmm.
he started doing it after he retired, and at which point he did kind of become a recluse, and he just lived in his attic, right, and didn't
Hmm.
really do much. Um, but getting back to sort of this reassessment as art, and here's I think this is a very good example of I do, if you had asked him at the time, you had gone up to Henry Darger and said, "Are you an artist?" Right? I don't know what he would have said, and I don't know if he thought he was creating art. It was this obsessive need that he had to create this fantasy world because he was so horrified by this news article that he read in 1911 about a 4-year-old girl who was kidnapped and murdered. So he was never, presented it as art. He never circulated in the art world. He didn't know any artists, right? Art was not a part of his day-to-day existence. So there's this theory of art, which is called institutionalism, and it states that an object can only become art in the context of the institution known as "quote unquote" the art world. So that is what Duchamp was attempting to get at when he plopped a urinal up on a table and said, "This is art because I am an artist and I'm presenting it at an art exhibit." It's that a thing is defined strictly as art if it is presented as art. And if you're part of the art world, then you're an artist and you're presenting things as art. It's not that value sort of like this is art. That is art, right? It's the strictest definition of the word. So then, how do we describe these kind of works that are by people who were never attempted to display them as art? Who, I mean, we don't know if they consider themselves artists or not. Maybe Vivian Meyer, yes. Charles Delachaux, probably not. Henry Darger, I don't know what he would have called himself, right? But like, do we call this art? I mean, now that it's been sort of like appreciated by the art world as these great examples of either like folk art or like outsider art, it's achieved that label. But it becomes this interesting kind of definition of sort of like, because it also gets into, I think, the motivation of the creator, which is if they're not creating these things to display or to show or to share or to present as art, then by the strictest definition of the word, what is this that they're doing? And this question gets really kind of complicated with no good answer in the final example that I have, which is the Philadelphia Wireman. Have you ever heard of the Philadelphia Wireman?
Unless it's someone who put like high wires across buildings and then like walked
Mhm.
across them. No. Okay.
No. So of all the outsider artists, this is the outsideriest. Because whereas Charles Delachaux and Vivian Meyer and Henry Darger were all working in a medium that is easily understandable to us, collage, visual art, watercolor, photography, right?
Mhm.
These are things that are art. The Philadelphia Wireman, it was doing something so out there that it's impossible to say really what he was doing or why. And also, we don't know who he was. So this is another example of that, the right person at the right time. So in 1982, a man is walking down an alley in a poor neighborhood in Philadelphia. The alley cut behind a transient rooming house, which used to be much more common. A rooming house was just a place where you could stay for like $1 a night, basically people who were less sort of like on the fringes of society and were within one day's rent of being homeless, pretty much. And it's at night, and he sees these strange piles of wrapped things that were in the process of being thrown out, and they're spilling out of this crumbling shed behind the rooming house. And it just so happened to be that this guy, and I forget his name, uh, he had contacts in the art world, right? He knew people in galleries. And he saw them, and similar to that Houston antiques dealer who found the Sonora Aero Club books, something speaks to him. He's like, he didn't know why, but he felt like they needed to be saved. So he went and got them, 1,200 of them. And what they are these bizarre assemblages of random items that were seemingly found in the street. Do you want to try to describe what we're seeing here to people who are not watching the video?
I mean, I can't really tell what that is, but it looks like almost like a gumball machine or something wrapped in a bunch of wires or something like that, with also like candy wrappers underneath the wires. And I mean, when I think of like modern art, sometimes when I'm walking through a modern art museum, I'll see something like this.
Yeah, so I think if you look at the bottom, I think that's actually a light bulb because you
Light
can
bulb.
see at the
Okay.
bottom left, yeah, so it's a light bulb that's been wrapped in this heavy gauge wire, and along with it are these like bits of trash, right?
Yeah.
And over again, you get these pieces.
This is great. I like this.
Mhm, mhm. There's an energy to them, right?
Yeah.
They would not look out of place in a modern art museum. There's creativity here. There is work being done.
Hmm.
Um, it's completely abstract.
It's
Um,
sculpture.
yeah, he's doing these small sculptures,
Yeah.
but by hand and like heavy gauge wire too. Like he must have been intensely strong if he was doing these by hand. And he's just wrapping up these bits of found objects. Here's another one. There's like a little seashell that he's found and a tag from something, right?
Hmm.
And he's wrapping things up. Here's a collection of them exhibited in an art museum, right? All laid
Hmm.
out like that. The one up front, I think, the pieces wrapper.
Yeah, that's what it looks like. What year was this?
Well, we think that they were about we as a like we Wikipedia thinks that they were about 1970.
Mhm.
This
And
is one of my
this
favorite
was
ones.
so this was found outside of a homeless shelter, you said, or
Yeah, a transient rooming house. So rooming
Mhm.
houses were kind of like pay homeless shelters, I guess you could. I mean, it was basically it was a bunch of shitty rooms. There's still one in Chicago that's like a men's hotel that's very, very cheap, but basically the rooms have no amenities. They have a bed. You can sleep inside if you had $1 for the night, right?
And
Like
these were like spilling out at like on the street or
hmm, they were
yeah.
spilling into the alleyway from a shed that was behind the rooming house.
Okay.
Where they had been piled and were just sort of like spilling out in the street and sort of in the process of being gathered up to be thrown away. This is one
So
of my favorite
possibly
ones.
the person who did it was some kind of like keeper of the inn or something like that, maybe.
They don't think so. I'll get into that in a second. But yeah, this is one of my favorite ones. I don't know why, but it's like a little toy TV with like a canoe on it, and it's wrapped in sort of like some clear plastic, and it kind of makes almost like an arrow shape. I don't know. It's just really cool looking. I really like it.
And
Um,
is that stand at the bottom? Was that from the artist or that's
no,
been
no,
created?
these
Yeah.
had no stands.
Okay.
All of
Yeah.
these have been, they were like that,
Yeah.
right?
Okay.
Just kind of like laying there.
Hmm.
Um, but yeah, so and that's all we know about them. Um, there's another one that kind of looks like a plane almost.
Yeah.
Um, but so in the only hint as to this person's identity was in 1999, a gallery visitor um in Philadelphia came up to people running it and without knowing correctly identified the street that it was found on.
Hmm.
They said, out of curiosity, was this found on like J Street or whatever? And they're like, yeah, how'd you know that?
Hmm.
And they said that in 1970, they had lived there and they often saw an elderly black man sitting on the back porch, wrapping things in wire.
Hmm. Okay.
And that's all we know. I mean, at this point, it's been, I mean, it was at this point, we're going on more than half a century. This guy was living in a transient rooming house. He was already elderly in 1970. He, if he had had close family, he probably would have been living with them. He wasn't.
Hmm.
There were no records that the rooming house kept because it was just kind of like, okay, do you got $1? There's a bed you can sleep in.
Hmm.
So we don't know who he is. We will never know, in all likelihood, who he is, and barring some kind of miracle. And he was working, yeah, like in sculpture, but not in like a readily sort of like, okay, that's, like again, photography, collage, watercolor, right? This is so out there. These things that are doing are so weird,
Yeah.
but so unique as well, right? It's like,
Well, it makes you wonder, like, was the guy's brain broken? Was there something wrong with him? Like, same with some of these other art people, not with the Vivian, because it seemed like she was just a straightforward, was doing photography, but like to like obsess, like for someone to obsessively do this and not be part of the art world or obsessively write a 15,000 word
yeah,
book about these like alien girl children and stuff like that.
yeah.
It seems
And
like
again,
there's a screw loose.
it's this monomaniacal obsession. So like, and like I like all times I like the word. I learned it. I didn't know it beforehand, but monomaniacal, which means like, like it's related to like obsessive disorder, right?
Hmm.
Monomaniacal. Now, some people have noted a similarity between these and West African fetish objects.
Hmm.
Um, um, uh, in which sort of items that have sort of our medicine are wrapped up together.
Hmm.
Some people have also noted sort of a similarity with medicine bundle, which kind of has this same idea of taking powerful objects and wrapping them up together. But ultimately, we don't know, and we'll never know. And so, like, that's why I said of all the outsider artists, this is the outsideriest, easily, right? Because it is impossible to know what this man's motivations were, why he made 1,200 of these things. I mean, imagine the time that it took him to gather up these things and find the wire and wrap them up. And just like I don't know how long it would take to make one of these things, but they didn't look like they were thrown together in like 10 minutes
Hmm.
because there's craft to them. And they have a similar aesthetic. They have a similar look, right? They don't look that, even though they are all made from completely different components and materials, they don't look that dissimilar. Like there's a style to them, right? Which is why for me this is the most fascinating one. And again, that example that you had of like if this is some local, in this case, if it had been like probably literally anyone else in the world, I mean, if you were walking down an alley in DC and you saw a bunch of like things wrapped in wire and they were trash, I mean, assuming you even stopped to look at them, right? I mean, I don't know if I would have that reaction either, right? He just the right guy who had connections to a gallery happened to see him. Something's it spoke to him and like he had to go get them. So and again, so you've got that kind of monomechanical obsession or that but to call it an outsider artist, as Carmen pointed out, may be shortchanging this guy because they may have been you know, some kind of ritualistic fetish object. They may have had sort of a imbued with sort of like some kind of power. If you search for like African fetish objects or West African, you'll see, for example, a common one are these like wooden figures with hundreds of nails like tapped into them, right? This guy could have been obeying like a religious or like a superstitious impulse, right? He could have been making these things for a purpose. And so to simply say sort of like outsider artist may be shortchanging is what he was doing because in his mind, he was doing something important for a
Mhm.
reason. But
Yeah.
again, we can't know. Which also just makes these so in because there's not that backstory attached to it.
Yeah.
So, you know,
Whenever you
oh,
were when you were in like school growing up and like out of sheer boredom, would you ever like start doodling something that was just like weird shapes? Like
yeah,
not even like trying to actually draw anything, but just like
I'm sure
just
everyone
cr
said that.
just creating like weird geometric shapes,
Mhm.
and it was just a combination of boredom, but then also kind of like you maybe find it kind of cool that you could create these like weird objects sort of on paper. I don't know, it just like kind of strikes me as something as similar to that. But like all those pages obviously got thrown away and never seen again. But like we were
Yeah,
creating this weird kind of art that wasn't really meant to be seen by anybody, but was some sort of creative expression.
yeah. But then, yeah, but like 99.999 repeating percent of people, you didn't keep doing it forever,
Yeah.
right? And yeah, I mean, the closest I can think of to like a hole that I found myself in. Yeah, so I used to draw a lot of Stickman Wars when I was
Hmm.
like bored in class,
Yeah.
and one day I filled up a piece of like blank paper with a Stickman War, just hundreds of little tiny Stickmen with little tiny machine guns and little tiny fighter planes, right?
Hmm.
And then I was like, well, I'm gonna make it bigger, so I pasted another sheet to it. By the time I was done, it was like 10 feet long.
Hmm.
And I think it was only done because I lost it, right? And also also getting bored at that point. But yeah, just sort of, whatever it was that was like, there was like an emotional need that it was filling, you're right. And sort of like this, but yeah, for whatever reason, this guy, I mean, he did it a lot. And we don't know anything about him. So yeah, getting back into this whole idea of like who's an outsider artist and who isn't. So like a person who is like commonly like called an outsider artist is, have you ever heard of Grandma Moses?
No.
Okay, she was a famous folk artist, but she achieved a lot of fame during her lifetime. So she wasn't discovered until she was almost, I think, 80, right? She took up painting in her 70s and started creating these sort of large folk paintings of things like this, right?
Hmm.
But she was actually exhibiting it when she was discovered. She was selling her paintings for a princely $5 at the time. Um, was in the I think the 60s or 70s, maybe. No, actually earlier, like 30s or 40s. Yeah, probably 30s or 40s, sorry. And then eventually like an art gallery owner was walking by a drugstore that had bought one of her pieces and was showing it and then asked for the contact information of the person who, she signed it. And then he was like, yeah, she makes these and she sells them and you can go buy her paintings too. And went and found them and then exhibited them in a gallery of like folk art, gain like immediate acclaim as this sort of like outsider artist. Um, but I mean, I don't know if it works as well for Grandma Moses because she was working in a medium, she was painting. She knew that these were paintings, she was producing them, she was selling them, not for a
Hmm.
lot of money. She was selling them to be exhibited, either in people's homes or in this case, the window of a grocery or of a drugstore, which has probably more foot traffic than any gallery you're ever going to go into,
Hmm.
because a lot of people are walking by it. Um, it should be noted though that so when at the time she was selling her paintings for $5, Again, like in like 1930 or 40 money, which is probably like 50 or 60 today. The current record for a Grandma Moses painting is $1.36 million.
Mm.
Um, uh, so I don't know if outsider artist works as well for her, because even though she lived her whole life outside of the art world, she knew what she was doing was a painting. She knew what she was doing. She was in her mind creating art, and then she was selling them as paintings for people to enjoy, right? Um, Basquiat, the uh, 1980s artist, was frequently labeled as an outsider artist, but he himself disputed this. He was like, "No, I'm well educated. I speak multiple languages. I went to art school." And he was part of like a collective community of like underground artists and graffiti artists and proto hip hop community people. So it didn't really work that well for him either. Um, I don't think that the qualifications of monomaniacal obsession and sort of never presenting as art are like must be met for someone to be an outsider artist. I think probably if someone could be an outsider artist without those things, but I think if you do have those two things, they're definitely sort of like, yes, you've found an outsider artist. And then for other people, it's probably on a spectrum. So yeah, Grandma Moses was a comparative outsider, but she gained fame during her lifetime and then continued to paint and like engaged with the art world. But it goes back to that definition of art. And I'm ending the slide here with, this is one of the many totes of undeveloped film negatives of Vivian Maier, as they were sitting, boxes and boxes and boxes and totes and totes and totes, is that um, it's it it's an interesting interplay with sort of like, what is art? Because if a thing is presented as art by an artist, then it meets that institutional definition of art. But then you have these people who sort of like are elevated to that position afterwards, after the work has been discovered. And so you get these really fascinating examples of these sort of people who had this like obsessive sort of like body of work and then were found later. And you had a really good point. And if the right person didn't walk by, how many of these people have we lost? How many people do we not know about? Probably a lot. But I guess like a question for like tying it into like present day is, are such things ever really going to happen again? You know?
Yeah.
I mean, given that we live very much in the era of social media and people are compelled to share what they're doing, they put it up on Facebook or Instagram. If you're into photography, you're going to have an Instagram. Even if you're not into photography, you're going to have an Instagram. If you make any kind of music, eventually you're going to make a SoundCloud, put it up on YouTube. If you write, right, you're going to, for our generation, you're going to have a live journal, or you're going to have like a medium. Like you're going to be engaged. And it's so easy to like put your work out there too, that, by sort of like this idea of these like lifetime obsessive outsider artists who live completely outside of the system, you would have to resist kind of the impulse to both engage with that world virtually and resist the impulse to sort of like share what you've created, which again is sort of like, it is our impulse now, especially with social media, to like, I mean, a lot of people cannot bother to eat a plate of food without taking an Instagram picture of it and sharing it with the world, right? So at which point, sort of like, they have crossed that boundary of like presenting a thing that they have created to the world, either like as music or as painting or as photography, right? So is this sort of like era of finding these posthumous people over? Are we have we passed it, and like there are no more new ones to discover? Um, very shortly, once social media has been around for like 20 or 30 years. And I think that's kind of the interesting question, I think, that ties into like how we create and share things today.
Yeah, I think it could still happen. Like I wish I had a better memory of this, but I remember coming across a somewhat well followed subreddit years ago where apparently there's like a genre of YouTube where I guess with some digital cameras, when you upload to the cloud, it like automatically publish them the videos to YouTube or something like that. But it's a genre of YouTube video where there's no title. The title of the YouTube video is just a file name, like
Hmm.
some like a random string of numbers.
Yeah.
And so like there was like a subreddit that was just dedicated to searching and finding these YouTube videos
Hmm.
that were kind of never meant to have an audience, that were just
Yeah.
like these like random uploads from these cameras and stuff like that.
Hmm.
Um, Certainly we take a ton of photos. There are people taking tons of photos who don't really have social media today. We all know people who really aren't into social media, and yet they still have these smartphones. They're probably, you know, maybe they have like really interesting lives or like a mailman or something like that, and maybe they're just taking photos on their route and things. So I don't know. There seems like there could still like we certainly have more ways to capture and create art now today, and not
Mhm.
everybody is going to be discovered during their lifetime, or maybe don't even recognize what they're doing as art that they might be discovered later. Like for instance, like fan fiction.
Mhm.
Like I think some fan fiction people do want to be famous, but I think like some fan fiction is written completely out of compulsion. Like it's not they're not trying to be read, that they just enjoy the writing itself. So
Yeah, there's
like,
that famous example of that Harry Potter fan fiction book called My Immortal,
no, I don't
which
know.
is
Yeah.
it's so long. It's
Hmm.
so long. And it is just bonkers. So it's like this Harry Potter fan fiction of like a vampire who goes to Hogwarts and has a relationship on again, off again with Draco Malfoy, and it is just hundreds of thousands of words, and like no one knows who did it because they
Yeah.
never like no one's ever owned up to it.
Yeah. And certainly like there could be an old man somewhere wrapping wire around things. So like,
Mhm.
and I don't know. I guess I understand what you're saying in the sense of like there are probably more people now who are actually, I think like the difference between now and then was like for a lot of people, especially who didn't grow up in some kind of world where they were connected to art, like the path to becoming a famous artist was so like unfeasible
Mhm.
that like they just would never have even bothered to try to, like that guy in the 1800s who was doing these weird like flying machines. Like
Mhm.
there were probably back then the number of professional artists in the world was probably pretty minuscule. There was no like there was no he probably didn't even know there was such a thing as like a full-time artist or anything like that. Whereas today
Yeah.
it's widely known that, like given the frictionless, you know, ecosystem of the internet, that anybody can become famous instantly with
Mhm.
just the right amount of luck and
Yep.
creativity. So more people are probably compelled to share their work publicly as a result.
Yeah, and I mean, and certainly, which could also be the case with like Henry Darger. I mean, that's also something that I mean, probably still, you're probably not really going to want to share with that many people anyway. Hey, do you want to see my 15,000 page hand illustrated novel about the rebellion child of naked child slaves on an alien planet and they have penises?
Yeah.
Right, that's going to be an odd share. That's going to be a weird conversation to have. I mean,
And
you may
so,
have known that it was absolutely fucking bonkers batshit when he was doing it.
yeah. Well, like, and I also think there's like certainly people, lots of people who make content and even publish it to the internet without there being really without them really caring if it becomes popular. Like, I would almost like say this podcast is that. Like,
Hmm.
I don't think we really care whether we have a listenership or much of a viewership for this podcast, right? Would that be
No,
an accurate?
I don't think we have dreams of like, being picked up by NPR. No.
Yeah, like
No.
my goal is to make it to at least I have this internal goal of making it to at least 50 episodes of this podcast. And I mean I have sort of an online brand that I cultivate, so maybe that will spread over to this podcast, and maybe by some trick of the YouTube algorithm like one of our videos goes viral. But
Mhm.
like we're not optimizing for that. We're not like turning all these levers to try to find as wide a listenership or viewership for these episodes. So,
I
you
mean, we are
know,
still presenting it as a podcast. I mean, we
yeah,
introduce it as a
yeah,
podcast and we do tell people where to go see it. But yeah, I mean, you're right. I mean, for me, my primary motivation is I just get to hang out with you more, albeit
yeah,
virtually, right?
yeah. And
Because we've been friends for a long time.
that was my pitch to you for this podcast, was that it
Yeah.
would be kind of low effort, just a fun reason to just get on video once a week. So
Yeah.
so let's say we upload our 50 episodes and then we get bored and we move on to something else. And then 10 years from now, suddenly someone, you know, finds this trove of episodes of these two guys from the year 2024 and they were going, on these
They're like, you've got to see this. These guys did not know what they were talking about,
yeah,
and they
yeah,
did it so much.
yeah. But
But yeah, it's sort of like, you get into like an interesting kind of conversation to considering like the way that we create like the number of people, you're right, who kind of consider themselves artists,
mhm.
like in a present day context, or like are even able to consider themselves artists, or creatives in kind of whatever medium. Um, and I mean, I guess my sort of like one thing I really get that I don't know will happen again though is the another example as good as these, right? Of
Yeah.
finding this huge body of completely unknown work by one person who was absolutely obsessed with blank and was doing it and not telling anyone about it. Although maybe I'm way off base there. Maybe it's more likely to happen because people are
I think it
taking
is. I think
things
it's
and
more
saving
likely to
them.
happen. Like, what if, like, couldn't you imagine, like, 5 years from now, someone going through the Internet Archive or something and obscure and finding this like live journal from 2003 of this person who ended up being like an incredible short story writer who was
Yeah.
writing these weird short stories that
Mhm.
were incredibly good, but they just didn't know how to break into the fiction market, and so
Yeah.
the only record are these like live journal entries or something like that.
On one hand, yeah, you've got this sort of like, at least temporarily, so much of what we make is like stored, right? And
Hmm.
sort of like, yeah, you could have the idea it's like somebody going through loved ones like Google Drive, right? And then finding
Yeah,
this incredible. On the other hand, that's also less permanent because you could be a
yeah,
person dies and you never get into their Google Drive, or uh, like when GeoCities got taken down. I mean, we could
yeah,
have lost several of those individuals when all those websites just went poof because
yeah,
none of them exist. Even this podcast
hmm,
exists in no physical form.
yeah,
It's hosted on YouTube as a bunch of ones and zeros. If YouTube vanished tomorrow because of a Carrington event, they would be gone forever.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
So on one hand, there may be it may be more likely that there will be another one of these things of a person who just quietly created obsessively and made a thing online. Maybe they were just really into like they were doing a Henry Darger thing, but with like Photoshop.
yeah,
And they did it, and then so, but then on the other hand, if it's just on a hard drive, then and like, or if their laptop has a password and nobody knows it, then um or you find a hard drive like and it's 40 years from now, how the hell do it like how would you access like a 3.5-inch floppy drive right now,
yeah.
right?
Do you know what Horse eBooks is?
Horsey books,
Yeah.
like a book about a horsey.
Well, so the words horse ebooks don't make any sense. Does
Oh,
it?
horse e-books, okay, no, okay.
Yeah. So this is kind of old internet by now, but like it was discovered. I don't know who discovered it, that there was just this random Twitter account, because there's tons of just random Twitter accounts that are just spam accounts that are just pulling nonsense from the internet and like pulling it together and then tweeting it out. And someone discovered this account called it was like horse underscore ebooks, and it was just like tweeting the most like bizarre phrases that were just like you could tell it had been pulled from multiple sources and stuff like that. And there was some kind of like very primitive AI that was like forming them into sentences that sort of made sense, but also were like completely bizarre. And all of a sudden, it started getting these retweets, and it became like it got like hundreds of thousands or maybe even millions of followers, and it was just this random like spam account that was tweeting out like sometimes coherent nonsense, but sometimes the nonsense just happened to coincide to something that was happening in the news. So it was like there were these ones that went super duper viral just because it tweeted it out just as some other piece of news was breaking, and
Yeah.
it just had enough of a connective tissue to whatever that news was that it seemed like it was maybe a commentary on that news. And then it was later revealed, years later, that two former BuzzFeed employees had actually had originally been just a nonsense spam account, but they had somehow tracked down the owner of the account and purchased it and taking it over. So at some point, it stopped tweeting out. I mean, it was still nonsense, but it was human written nonsense. But you could argue that was, at least before the BuzzFeed staffers took it over and started knowingly playing with the public and stuff like that, and that it really was like a piece of AI spam found art or something like that.
I'm picturing a scenario where like I don't know, like 40 years from now, somebody finds like a plugged in like Apple laptop that had been forgotten about, and somebody had like written a script for an AI to make a thing, and then it got caught in like a loop, and it had just been making this thing by
Yeah,
itself for like 30 years and had evolved into something just utterly brilliant. And it's yeah, it's this great example of like AI outsider found art, right? Sort
yeah,
of like it's just created this amazing thing, but it just been sort of locked in a closet and forgotten about.
yeah. Okay, I think
Anyway,
we're running a little long in the tooth.
we are.
I think we're about an hour and a half in. This might be our longest episode, but
But I hope those were four interesting stories about outsider artists that I shared with you.
yeah,
And for anyone who watched the videos at home, you get to look at some pretty images.
yeah. And for anybody who's been listening to the audio version for this long, I have no idea what you're doing and why you've stayed listening this long
Don't you
because
have family that 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 love you and that who and you love and you could go be with instead of listening to us, or even a cat?
yeah. Um, all right, Craig. Well, that was fun. I know that usually this is the point where you ask me what I'm thinking about doing next week, and I really need to get better about actually being prepared with an answer, but I really don't know. I haven't
I
looked at my
wasn't even
Google
gonna.
Doc.
I had forgotten about that entirely. So you just outed yourself.
Yeah. Okay, cool. All right, well, I'm gonna go ahead and stop the recording and we'll see
Yeah, buddy.
everybody next week. Stop recording.